So thank you, and we start with your talk. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. So thank you very much for this invitation. So as I was saying to Francis and Thomas, it's interesting because my work is mainly in philosophy and biology and theoretical biology, and the kind of framework I work in has close relations with the cybernetic tradition, and in spite of that, there are very important differences in conceptual and theoretical tools. And actually, I should talk for hours and taking concepts one by one and showing to what extent they are deriving different meanings according to the research program, which is at the same time interesting and somehow a pity, because there is a sort of family here between these approaches, and then differences that are becoming more evident to me. So let's make a selection of all these issues, and this is story that I present with my PhD student Auguste Nas, which is co-directed by me and Dennis Walsh in Toronto, and by chance the two institutes has exactly the same name, two different entities. The two institutes for the history and philosophy of science and techniques. So I will focus on the theme, the topic, which is goal-directedness. One of the issues is that we tend to talk about purposiveness or even finality. But that's because I'm a philosopher, so I use the old words. But one question is whether there are different meanings under the effect of using purposiveness or goal-directedness. I will try to make a quick characterization of the idea of purposiveness provided by Cybernetics, especially through the papers that I've been reading for this meeting, so the talks written by you. And my claim is that even if it captures some central intuitions, I would try to make the claim that there are some aspects that are not adequately captured by these characterizations. And my claim is that maybe we can have a different and more richer understanding coming from the theory of biological autonomy. That's in the context of a sort of agreement about, on the one hand, the fact that we agree that purposiveness should have an explanatory role, should have a status in the theory of complex systems, especially biological systems, and that this notion is in need of a naturalization, so that we have to find a way to make it compatible with natural science. There is a deep connection between cybernetics and autonomy. Autonomy, as I understand this term, this word, this concept, is a sort of generalization of the classical notion of autopoiesis. So Varela wrote a entire book called Principle of Biological Autonomy. And then there is the main authors which I rely on is on the scientific side are Varela, are Robert Rosen, and Stu Kaufman. And the whole Basque group, so Álvaro Moreno, with whom I wrote an entire book on autonomy in 2015. Álvaro Moreno is also one of the contemporary authors that worked a lot on biology, on autonomy in the biological domain. The focus is essentially on biological systems. On the other hand, autopoiesis emerges historically from cybernetics, notably through the work of Umberto Maturana. And yet, somehow surprisingly, they diverge in the both philosophical and theoretical understanding for purposiveness, at least to some extent. Interestingly, Maturana and Varela, for instance, in their book Autopoiesis and Cognition, published in 1980, write that purposiveness has no explanatory value. So they wrote that living systems as physical autopoietic machines are purposeless systems. So I totally disagree, even though I agree on almost everything else. But the philosophical implications, there are also historical reasons why they claim something like that. They want to stay away from the idea that they have a strange theory, an unnatural theory, because classically purposiveness is associated with God, with divine intention, etc., etc. And this misunderstanding is very clear, is very present in the mind of many scientists. We think that if they talk about purposiveness, they are talking about the supernatural entities. And I guess that this claim is this kind of origins, even in their case. So in the case, what I'm trying to do is a sort of summary of what I've understood by reading some of classical papers and the papers that you sent for this meeting. Of course, purposiveness was a classical, a foundational concept for cybernetics. And one of the definitions, I took the definition by Francis in this submitted paper, which is that the behavior purposiveness exists when the behavior of a system is consistently directed toward a particular state. And the important word in a sense is consistently. What do we mean by consistently? And if I understand correctly, then this term can be unpacked in terms of equifinality. And then the definition is from the other paper saying, in which we write that the system should move toward the direction defining its goal under a variety of circumstances. The latter is known as equifinality. No matter the condition of one starting, the system will always achieve the same result. And then there are discussions about related notions as plasticity and persistence. But even in this morning talk, you were again referring to equifinality as the defining concept of purposiveness or goal-directedness. The claim that I make is that in philosophical terms, this cybernetic stance, which has a behavioristic flavor to me, consisting fundamentally in understanding purposiveness as directionality. This is also something that is mentioned in your paper. And then I have a sort of argument or objection or criticism, which is that this stance is liberal, very liberal, and some of the thoughts were referring to the scope of the accounts that you were proposing, in the sense that it seems to provide a very general notion of purposiveness. One of the consequences is that it enables, at least in principle, some kind of physical systems to be understood as purposive. As soon as the dynamics, and this morning we have talked a lot about that, can be captured in terms of equifinality, and formally speaking, in terms of attractors. And that's why also classical examples are often discussed as the classical example of the ball in the ball. So saying that purposiveness applies to the ball in the ball looks a bit too permissive. So works try to provide restrictions to that definition. And I try to order some of them. One is that the system, is important one, is that the system, the goal state must maintain the system in far from equilibrium conditions. So we have discussed that also this morning. My objection is that this looks to me ad hoc, in the sense that on what ground a system that maintains itself in far from, the very fact of being far from equilibrium would provide a characterization of purposiveness as such? The answer, which is given, is because in this case, the system is doing something instead of being an equilibrium to attain the goal. So it does something to maintain, and that is this intuition that gives us the idea of be oriented toward the goal. But then, second objections, it doesn't seem to me necessary to be an agent in order to remain in far from equilibrium conditions. Actually, there is a debate we were mentioning with Francis this morning, that there's a debate on whether we should understand the sympathetic system as self-maintaining systems or systems that are stationary, but sufficiently determined by boundary conditions. And then the question whether they are actually realizing a loop of self-maintenance is open to debate. But in any case, even though they were not able to do something, they would be purposeful, even though they were completely determined by boundary condition according to the definition. Because if being purposive means staying, attaining a goal state which is far from equilibrium, then this is not necessarily demanding that the system does something. It could be empirical conditions, not something that defines the fact of being purposive. So I see that these notions, at the very least, requires clarification on what that would mean that the system is doing something to maintain out or far from equilibrium, and if it's necessary to get this stationary state. Other amendments that are mentioned, I selected those seem to me the most important. One is the idea that purposiveness means some sort of freedom or independence from causality. This brings a very clear intuition. It says that agents seems to be systems that produce actions in a way that is somehow underdetermined, to say the least, from causation. So we spontaneously do actions. This is intuitive, but of course, as you know, this is philosophically, to say the least, very tricky to actually argue that being purposive means to be free from causality. So unless we were able to provide a very strong philosophical, this is a very old debate, of course, about emergence, etc. So I personally do not find most of the arguments of the independence from center level of description from underlying level very convincing. So this is a very tricky direction to go, even though it could be the case. And there was one example mentioned in the paper, it was your paper, which was supposed to be an example of this. So the leaf blown by the wind is not is determined by by causality, and sailing that exploits the wind is an example of a sort of spontaneous and relatively independent behavior. Well, actually, I don't know if this example actually is an example of this difference, because looks like an example of the fact that the leaf is not exploiting the wind because he has no goal or end state that has some relevance for his own maintenance or something, while we are intentionally exploiting the wind so as to get a certain result. So the example is, I don't know if this is a good example, or if my final example is actually an example of where purposiveness looks like some sort of freedom from causality.
Why isn't that a good example?
I think that
the sailing is.
I see the difference as in terms of we exploit the wind because independently, whether we have not to decide where this sailing is independent from causality. What matters is that we are exploiting is the direction of the action is important, not the fact that we are independent from previous causation.
Right. No, but
use the input, but we get a bit independent from it.
I don't really see the link. So I understand that.
The first part of the definition was a directionality, and the second part of the definition is that the directionality is defined internally in the system, not just because the wind blows in that direction, you go in that direction. No, independently of which direction blows go, you go there because you have an internal determination that tells you whenever the wind moves me towards the where, I change the rudder and I go in that direction.
That's why I see this I see this a clear example of directionality. I have some hesitation about the fact is an example of independence from causality.
There's never independence of causality, it's relative autonomy. You are more or less dependent on the wind.
Yeah, even that.
If I'm in a motorboat, I don't care much about the wind. If I'm in the sailboat, I'm relatively dependent on the wind. If I'm a leaf, I'm completely dependent on the wind.
Yeah. So that's the second point. And the third correction could be done is concerted action, which also I interpret that as the idea of functional differentiation. So the fact that the system is complex enough so that you can discriminate between different contributions to the goal. And that's certainly something that goes with intuitions, and I agree with that. The problem is that how does concerted action as such ground purposiveness? So when I say that it is ad hoc in the sense that it restricts the set of systems that could be the object of function of understood as purposive, but the question is that it doesn't seem to provide a principle. My objection is it doesn't seem to provide a principle criterion to define purposiveness. So that's very quick, so I'm not giving more details, but we, I mean, me and Ruz, the claim would be that cybernetic account seems to, in a sense, fall short to capture the core of purposiveness because it interprets, precisely because it interprets purposiveness as directionality, and then tries to restrict in a relevant way the class of systems, because directionality is also widespread in physics because of the possibility to model through attractors. And then that's where a sort of alternative understanding could be put forward, which is that instead of grounding purposiveness in directionality, the idea would be that it has to do with circularity in a specific sense. And now, of course, wait. So the cyberneticians do emphasize circularity is at play in purposiveness, typically in negative feedback loops. So this was made clear by Francis this morning. But then the other criticism that I would like to put on the table is that, yes, but I maintain that, if I understand correctly, circularity does not define, the feedback loop does not define purpose. So in my memories, Rosenbluth's argument there is very complex because it distinguishes between purposiveness, teleology, etc., etc. But feedback loops are a mean to obtain equifinality, as could in principle other mechanisms. So it is not something that used to define what purposiveness is, which remains fundamentally understood as directionality, but something that we use to get that result. So it's not something that defines circularity, purposiveness. Purposiveness is not something that has to do fundamentally with circularity. And the funny thing is that autopoiesis and autonomy, which derive from cybernetics, in my understanding, do put forward an alternative conception in which purpose is a cause, is a final cause, which explains why the system is there. So the fundamental move of purposiveness is a determination that provides, contributes, explain why the system is there, not just what it does, but why it's there. And in my understanding, this is fundamentally what the traditional philosophical reflection on purposiveness is about, is a common point between Aristotle, Kant, for instance, and more recently, the work of Robert Rosen on this matter. Actually, there are not that many philosophers that work on that because this notion of purposiveness has been sort of mixed up with the other notion, which is the divine notion. So most philosophers just put that under the table. But some of them, we have some organicist understanding, have elaborated on that. But purposiveness is the fact that the system plays a role in determining its own condition of existence. So it's not, we have a sort of impression of directionality, but what actually is going on is that we have a generative circularity that is understood in terms of, I would say, is a self-determination. A purposive system, that's what we wrote, actually, this were our contribution began in a paper with Leo Bick. A purposive system is a system whose activity plays a role in determining some condition of existence. And so the circularity is between being and doing. And if you have an purposive system, it means that the system is there. You explain why the system exists because of what it does. What is behind this is the difference between two kinds of purposiveness, intrinsic and extrinsic. This goes with the bit rough and too quick criticism of Jonas about on cybernetics that you, of course, you know. I do not agree with the way of putting the thing because it's not a conclusion, it's a theoretical stance. But what I would say is that if you understand purposiveness as directionality, then you do not focus on the fact that you can distinguish between two ways of elaborating the circle between activity and existence. One is intrinsic purposiveness, the idea that you have a system in which you can describe in such a way that you can show that it actually contributes to own condition of existence. So it is, in a sense, its own telos. So the purpose of the system is maintaining at least some of its condition of existence. So the telos is one and the same thing that the system itself is its own telos. That is what most of the philosophical debate is about. In contrast, you have extrinsic purposiveness, which is the fact, again, the activity of the system explains its own existence, but this happens indirectly. So if you take an artifact, a knife exists because of what they do. So they are there because they cut things, and the reason why there are knives in the world is because they cut things. But you cannot explain this circularity just by looking at the system. You have to locate this artifact in a larger system, possibly in this case a social system, or at least a symbiosis or an extended phenotype, where you are explaining that there is another system, which is an intrinsic purposive system, which has built knives or something else to improve its condition of existence. So you have a different two levels of purposiveness, where this one actually relies on that one. If you have extrinsic purposive, it's because somewhere you have an intrinsic purposive system. And of course, the initial idea is that the distinction and relationship between intrinsic and intrinsic purposiveness maps on the distinction between organisms, roughly speaking, and artifacts. Because both of them are purposive because of the circularity between doing and being. They are purposive because they exist because of what they do. But artifacts, as I was saying, rely on the existence for organisms, organized entities, which ground artifacts purposiveness. So it's serving versus having a purpose, exerting a function in contrast to being organized. So if you have functional systems, functional entities, you need an organization to which functional entities belong. It seems to me that this, in spite of a sort of connection, diverges from the cybernetic account, which actually ascribe the same kind of, in principle, the same kind of purposiveness to both kinds of systems. In the theory of autonomy suggests ascribing, making a philosophical distinction in hierarchy. So artifacts and even other part of organisms, organs, are there because they are functional parts of organized systems. So that said, there is a lot of work to be done, a lot of theoretical work, because yes, we can focus on circularities, but then that's just the beginning of the story. So classical descriptions and models of autonomy, in my view, underdetermine the distinctive biological circularity between existence and activity, so this generative circularity. There are various classes of non-biological systems which can be described as realizing circular regimes. So the water cycle, for instance. So if you want to say that, unless you want to claim that your theory say that the water cycle is a purposive regime because the system is maintaining some condition of existence, then you have to be much more precise in theoretical terms, saying what kind of circularity is at work in biological systems that enable us to ascribe functions and telos and not to physical systems. Would require a long discussion, but this is where I think one of the major contributions of authors like Rosen and Stuart Kauffman, is that they have suggested that if you want to understand biological organization, we have to locate the dependencies at the relevant level of description. So you have systems where you have processes, reactions, and then constraints that orient the dynamics. And if you want to describe organization, you have to describe organization of constraints. What is organized are the constraints. So we have wrote a paper with my colleague Maya saying, well, we try to put together Rosen and Kauffman, very well-known work constraint cycles, say, well, what they are talking about is the fact that the biological system generate the constraints. I have to be very quick, but biological constraints act on process and reactions, of course, which adapt a specific behavior because of those constraints. And those processes are oriented in such a way that they regenerate and maintain the constraint themselves. That's the Kauffman idea. As a result, the constraints depend on each other for their resistance and maintenance over time. So organizational closure, that's another term that you also use, but has a slightly different meaning. It's more general in your account, if I understand correctly. Designates the mutual dependence between the constraints, which is a way of understanding in a more restricted way the idea of organization. The larger organization of constraints realizes the self-determination of self-constraint. So it's a sort of way of specifying this idea of circularity. So we have tried to make a lot different illustration of that. I wouldn't say a word about that, from a very vague idea that what you want is that your constraints, you have to distinguish the causal role of constraints and processes, and then show me that actually there is a set of constraints whose existence depends on the fact they are in the system. So you're focusing on the constraints. And we're trying to make a bit more specific illustration, but I have to skip. So just about that, there would be a lot to be discussed about the effect of understanding organization as constraints. It is true that if you use this definition, you can say, well, for instance, a water cycle is not an organization of constraints because the water cycle is determined by constraints from the slope and the temperature and the sun, etc., etc. That actually determine its dynamics, and the river or the water cycle would exist, even though it would exist, even though you do not change the constraints. So you put the constraints and you get a water cycle. So the water cycle.
What are the constraints?
I mean all the external constraints as the conformation of the slope, for instance.
In general, what is a constraint? Sorry, I think
that's what I put
yeah.
At the end.
Okay.
This is a sort of synthesis between Rosen and Kauffman.
Yeah.
So constraints are entities that operate on processes but are locally conserved. So there is a time scale, which is the characteristic time of the process. You take the process, determine the crisis time, and then you have something else that modifies the dynamics but is locally conserved. So as an enzyme, for instance.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, that was my.
Okay. So sorry, I'm skipping all details, but
yeah. No,
fundamental question.
Clear. That's clear. Just I was trying to map it to the.
That's
exactly what I thought it would be. And
that's
exactly what we also say.
That's funny because actually there's an interesting story because when Rosen used in his initial work, Rosen used this language, talks about constraints and laws as his master Patti, and then he moved to an Aristotle language, to material and then efficient causes, and his Patti said, what they're doing now is completely busy, they won't understand the word.
So then constraints are like the context on which these mappings that Peter was speaking about.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why you were giving the river example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Because in the river example, you put the constraints are independent of the cycle. The river can modulate the bed, but actually the river would exist independent of modulating the bed. So the river as a sort of flow can modulate the context, is not determining the existence of the context. Actually, that's why I put this strange image. You could build an artificial water cycle would be just a water cycle. In principle, with no difference, even though you were able to put, instead of having natural constraints, an artificial system. You have exactly the same kind of water cycle. In contrast, if you put artificial constraints in an organism, is no more an organism than a machine. So you are completely changing the system. That's where just to conclude, so there is a way of trying to establishing a theoretical difference between a cycle of transformations and organizational constraints, which for me is the main and most important message from these people. But then you can also ask a philosophical question. Well, let's assume that the water cycle is different from an organism in terms of the causal structure. Why saying that the organism is purposive and not the water cycle? The question stands. And then where we try to provide an answer, which I think really requires an answer. So the idea is that being purposive means that what you do contributes to determine your existence. And that this idea must be spelled out. So the condition of existence of the water cycle are met independently, are there before that the cycle actually happens, from the causal action that it possibly exerts for the boundary condition, which is possible. It could exert an action to can change the boundary conditions. The water cycle would exist even though the river did not modulate its own bed. It would be different, but you still have a water cycle. If you have intrinsic purposiveness, this does not merely point to the realization of a circular relation between causes and effects, but to the situation in which the activity of a system, by producing some effects, contribute to specify, in the sense of determine, the conditions at which the circular relation as such can occur. If the system were not exerting these effects, there would be no system, because they will be underdetermined by the physical and chemical conditions. So by obeying external constraints, the dynamics of physical cycles do not specify themselves. They self-maintain. They simply occur if some conditions are met. They occur. And cycles self-maintain, so we can say that they self-maintain is another notion that you use. The question is, can we make a difference between self-maintenance and self-determination in the sense of playing a role in making the system possible? And if this distinction works, then we can say that not any cycle, typically not any physical cycle, is a purposive regime. I'm almost done. So compared to directionality, self-determination is much more restricted. It's supposed to be much more restricted because an attractor is not enough, because you want a specific configuration of constraints, and not even a cycle of transformations, as the case of the carbon cycle or whatever physical. So this is supposed to exclude, in theoretical terms, many physical systems. On the other hand, notice that the overarching goal, keep existing, actually allows to switch adaptively between different goals, different specific goals that the system can pursue because of, according to the circumstances, or even invent entirely new solutions, new strategies to survive. So in a sense, if you consider the self-determination, being purposeful is not being homeostatic as such. Remaining alive, man usually does require modifying its own norms. That's why the term is autonomy. So you modify the laws because you have an overarching goal that might require shifting all the time or inventing new solutions. So again, here also, homeostasis could be a mean, a fundamental mean, but something that could possibly be broken if we have other needs, at least to some extent. And this also emphasizes where this part has to do with the restriction of positive physical regimes, systems. Here, what is at stake is the difference between organisms and machines. And actually, just to mention this, the main motivation that Kant had when he first introduced the idea of self-organization, this work comes from his critique of judgment, was to make a distinction between organisms and machines. This was the initial motivation. If we have, that's funny compared to what this story has produced, because in a sense, the recognition between Kant and cybernetics. And it is very clear in his own wording that actually, if you want to make sense of purposiveness, we have to make a distinction between these and artifacts. So, both cybernetics and autonomy theory, strive to naturalize purposiveness and make it an explanatory tool in science and in biology. In spite of the historical and conceptual connection, they seems to me that they are substantially different conception of purposiveness, if my description is fair enough. Why this is because cybernetics focuses on directionality, and autonomy relies on circularity in the sense that I've tried to summarize here. And I think that the point is that also by considering the history of this debate, autonomy captures, in my view, a more fundamental aspect of purposiveness. And because of that, it restricts more adequately the kind of natural system to which purposiveness could be ascribed. That's because it's a better, more adequate grasp of what purposive means, then it flows that some systems are no relevant anymore for this discussion. Thanks.
Okay, we start the question round. Francis.
Okay,
Francis want to talk.
To start with first, I think we are much more agreeing when you make it to look. I think we agree about almost everything except a few terminology. When you speak about the cybernetics, here you're speaking about what is called first order cybernetics. When I'm speaking about cybernetics, I'm speaking about the whole range, including Maturana, and second order cybernetics, where circularity, self-maintenance, autonomy is of course important. If we speak about the first order cybernetics, we speak about so-called autopoiesis, producing something else than yourself. When we're speaking about organisms, we speak about autopoiesis, producing yourself. Why do I include directionality? Because if you just speak about self-maintenance, you get a very conservative view of life. Like it's just keeping things the way they are. While in biological organisms, there's a second aspect, which is not maintenance, but which is growth. And growth, I don't interpret just in the quantitative sense of becoming bigger or having more offspring, which is part of what fitness is producing as much offspring as you can, but also in developing yourself, in getting better, in getting fitter, in what Maslow would call self-actualization, psychological growth. So that growth implies that there is a directionality, but there is not really an end point. So just maintaining what you have, that gives you a very conservative point of view. Like the only purposive systems are systems that just want to keep everything the way they are. So that, but I agree in your understanding of self-maintenance, you also have this growth aspect. So that's not that important. There is another difference, is that I want to de-emphasize the difference between living and non-living systems. Why? Because I want to understand the origin of life. And in order to understand the origin of life, you should be able to understand things that are kind of in between life and non-life. That means you will have things that have some constraints externally imposed, some internally imposed constraints. That's why I don't want to be too strict in saying internally imposed, externally determined, because we are all also externally determined. I can't claim that gravity does not exist. Gravity is a constraint that I have not invented, that I can't do anything about, except trying not to fall. On the other hand, I have lots of internal constraints that the external forces have nothing to do with, and I'm maintaining these internal constraints. And the most important thing that's lacking, you might say, in your story is the link with COT, because COT is precisely a way of bridging the gap between these notions of self-maintenance, autopoiesis, which tend to remain very abstract, and then the more mathematical style models like cybernetics, where you can draw the processes and see how this process leads to that process. And if I make this process faster, what happens? what COT does is not only it describes self-maintenance in the terms of circularity, like in the water cycle, but it also allows catalysts. That means constraints in your terminology, which are produced by other reactions. And then, as I said, in the case of living systems, I see it as a 3-level. First level is just a cycle. Second level, it's a catalyzed cycle. That means there are constraints being produced. And third level, you have the DNA that kind of keeps track of all the catalysts and make sure that the catalysts can be made whenever they need to, because it's invariant, because it's itself not participating in the reactions. So if you want a definition of life, you will need those 3 levels. But if you want to look at the origin of life, you will have to start at the first level and then see some of the second level emerge, and then maybe see some of the third level emerge, and there will be all these kind of intermediate cases. And the water cycle, maybe it is a little bit of the intermediate case, like you gave the example of the river creating its own bed. And you say, yes, but it's still dependent on the external constraints. Yeah, but it is to some degree creating itself, because I could imagine that there are places where the river ends in a swamp, and the swamp just goes into the soil, and the groundwater goes to the sea, and there is no more river. But if the river has a sufficiently strong flow that it erodes a channel to the swamp, and that channel erodes a dam that was between the swamp and the sea, the river has created its own. So, of course, the river is not a good example of a living system. But
yeah, but so we agree on almost everything. So
yeah.
On this point, I insist. If I try to draw the causal architecture of using these ideas of processes, concepts, etc., of living system, very, very schematic, and water cycle, they are completely different. They are completely, because I can write, so the constraints are independent. I can write a cycle where you have a set of constraints that determine the cycle, and there is no need, there is no need for the cycle to alter the constraints. They could, you're right, but the water cycle doesn't need to do that to exist. I cannot do that for a living system if I accept Kaufman's ideas. The system must produce its own constraints. So it is true that you can find limiting cases, but the two descriptions are, at least as starting point, completely different. You can find sort of strange cases, but I insist on the fact that, theoretically speaking, is an interesting guidance to distinguish between cases where, on the one hand, I have a cycle of transformation, constrained, independently constrained cycle of transformation, or a closure of constraints, where the constraints, some of them, of course, not all of them, some of them are there because they are in the cycle, in the loop. So I agree with you, but I find it most interesting to have something that gives you at least a schema to make distinctions, and then not merging.
No. Of course, I agree. Of course, I want to distinguish between the water cycle and the living system. But if I'm interested in the origin of life, I will need to look at these intermediate cases. For example, the model of Terence Deacon with his autogen, where the autocatalytic cycle, which is just an ordinary dissipative structure, generates capsids, and the capsids encapsulate the cycle. It is kind of creating its own constraint. It's an extremely simple constraint, but it might be one step towards the origin of life. And what we're trying to do in COT is we generate random reaction networks, and that means that there will be reactions that will be catalyzed, and there will be reactions that are not catalyzed. And then we will perturb them and see which ones survive. And what I expect is that the ones that survive, that means the resilient ones, will have a number of catalysts playing particular functions, so they will be generating their own constraints. But we can't be biased by what we know now. Now we are biased, we know life functions like that, the water cycle functions like that. So we tend to think, it needs to be the one or it needs to be the other. Maybe evolution has taken some intermediate steps that we would never think of, because.
Although I have ideas about origin of life, but I do not disagree with about that. We can talk for hours. So
there's a little question there. Don't you think that this I mean, Francis is getting to the discussion whether constraints or processes. Don't you think so that we better just stick to the terminology of Rosen in terms of causality? Why just don't say this closure of constraints is just closure to efficient causation? And then we can say, okay, then a living system is closer to efficient causation, but it is open to material causation, which is completely like, it gives you an idea that you are saying, okay, and this openness to material causation is not just a flow of energy and matter, but it is in terms how Rosen interpreted this openness to material causation is basically an openness to dynamics.
Yeah.
More than thermodynamics.
The answer is that's why we wrote that paper. That because we have some models. One is autopoiesis. Autopoiesis makes no elaboration of the distinction between processing and constraints. It's processing, producing components, producing. It's totally flat in the characterization. Then you can interpret that in a more complex way. And Rosen, the problem is that yes, I'm a philosopher, so efficient causation, material causation. But please show me an efficient cause. How do you ascribe to an entity the status of efficient cause? Looks to us not that easily operational notion. A constraint is something that actually has the characterization which comes from physics. So it's easier you ascribe a conservation property in a certain time scale, and then that is operational. So it's a way of us to go into a naturalization of the ideas, and then corresponds to what Rosen, I think, called efficient causes. And I insist, the intuition that Rosen had to, if you want to understand biological circularity, you have to be specific on what objects are taken. Not anything can be taken into the loop. Otherwise, we have no specific biological theory. I think that this is his best intuition, and it's very close to what Kaufman says. What he say, constraints, work constraints, etc., etc. So you see, you can talk about a bit on Aristotelian language, but it's very interesting. And it looks very, intellectual. But the constraints is more operational.
But I think so that there is a crucial point there. Rosen identified, like, at least give a clue about what could be an efficient cause. And you remarked there, it was kind of an enzyme, and specifically an active site of enzyme, which you cannot isolate from the folded enzyme.
Yeah.
So it is something that it is unfractionable from the system. So I think so that Rosen makes a clear point in saying, in materializing what is an efficient cause in terms of an active site, that the only possible way to you get this active site is within the closure of efficient causation.
I agree with that. Yeah.
And this is a huge problem in structural biology, because you have the protein folding problem. Mm-hmm. Which, if you give even to the best algorithms that we have on machine learning and in deep learning, to resolve the three-dimensional structure and the folding of the protein of a short peptide, they can reach just 91% of match compared to the crystallized folded enzyme. So I do think, again, that the case of the folded enzyme of the active site as a kind of specific example of efficient cause is clear enough already in Rosen to switch into a language that can blur in somehow this distinction of causality, because this is key to understand final cause in the organization of living systems.
Yeah. Actually, one part of the reason why I use the terminology is that you want to re-evaluate the final cause. So you imported all the language, a certain language, so as to locate final causes in a coherent language. So I agree. That is maybe a matter of terms there. But,
Peter, you have a question?
So basically, the
makes sense. Okay, so I have to start at the beginning. Sometimes when I present the stuff we are doing, then people from the higher sciences, so on the level of humanities, they say, okay, you're using all this nice terminology like semiotics and science and meaning, but actually all this doesn't exist in your domain. You're just using them as metaphors, yeah? And you're just fantasizing and they're not there actually. But they are, of course, very useful because you can make predictions and so on, but they are not actually science, they are not actually meanings, there's no information in the computer and so on. So now I understand why they are saying this, and but now the question is whether with the constraints it's the same. So that there are constraints, it's just our imagination. So in reality, constraints do not exist. And constraints are just a way to describe things and understand them better, but actually there are no constraints. They're just elementary interactions, and the system evolves. So if there are constraints, so if Kaufman is right and there are constraints determining the dynamics, I mean, we need a scientific instrument to determine whether there's a constraint or not. So it should be possible to, given the dynamical system, to have a criterion to say the dynamics of this system is governed by a constraint. Is there something like that?
It's something like that. So if the theory of autonomy is supposed to be operational, then you have to be able to produce models where you make a distinction, so you're able to identify processes or reactions and identify constraints. So entities to which you ascribe a conserved property at some time scale, fundamentally, my understanding is that's the point, that is relevant to understanding why the process is doing that direction. So if you have a reaction, then you have to an enzyme which has a conservation of the structure for a while, and that conserved properties plays a role in your model to say, well, that's because the reaction at that speed. And then what happens is that the reaction, the constraint loses its conservation after a while, or even disappears, and then the system has to rebuild the constraint.
Is there a tool like that?
Is a tool like that. That's what is supposed to be for me a theory of organizational closure. So
is there some tool that I can apply and check? So given the reaction network, find whether there's a constraint or not?
I mean, the constraint in this view, I think are just a catalyst. A catalyst is the thing that is necessary for the reaction to happen. If there's a different catalyst, a different reaction will happen.
As soon as
So
I
that
find
is a
the
constraint.
catalyst, it's a constraint.
The
Yeah,
catalyst is a constraint because the catalyst
Okay.
makes sure that this process happens and not this process.
Okay.
Without
Actually-
the catalyst, the process
actually,
will not happen.
not just, I mean, the vascular system is a constraint. Because if you want to understand why a molecule of oxygen can go from one point to another point, not by diffusion, but by transport, then you have to imagine that for a certain time scale, the topology of the vascular system is stable enough to assure this transport. So you are making a hypothesis and why this molecule goes from that to that instead of going anywhere, because there's a constraint. And you're looking for a constraint and you make a hypothesis on what is the relevant conserved properties. And the point is that if you are in biology, that's what Rosen would say, if you're in biology, then the system is itself building, rebuilding at its sum, not all, some of the constraints. If it's determining its own parameters.
But like my rusting car, it's also doing the same. Right?
What?
But it's my car that is rusting, that generates rust, also generating the constraint for the rust to evolve further, right?
Yeah. But the car, I guess that I don't know what car you have, but the car does not build its own constraints.
It's generating a catalyst, the rust is a catalyst.
Yeah, but the catalyst is part of its self-maintenance.
Right. So without the rust, it would not rust, right? So it's generating its own constraint.
No, here it's a
That's
constraint that is not self-maintaining.
Is not
because it is
contributing to maintain the
a
system.
constraint
No, it's
that is
maintaining the
destroying the
rusting
car.
car.
Oh, well, it's
The rust
maintaining.
is maintaining the rusting car.
Yeah,
So
but
you need the
how
rust to maintain it.
the rust is functional to the rest of the system?
Yeah, because without the rust, it would not be a rusting car. So you will not rust automatically. So
No,
you
but
need it as a catalyst.
the dependency must be between the parts. So you have a set of parts and
Yes.
actually show that each part exists because of the effect produced by the other parts and vice versa.
Each part. Okay.
Most of the parts, so it depends.
Okay,
So
then of course, the rust does not. Yeah,
that's the effects of the rust
yes.
is not required
Yeah, okay.
by any other parts of the system.
Okay.
That's why it's a machine.
Yes.
That's what Kant had in mind. That's why this is a machine, because
Okay. Okay.
is as a function. At some point, the machines, there is a loop, but the loop cannot be seen locally. Machines are sort of social, techno-social organs.
Okay.
But you have to include that in a wider system that explains why we have machines.
Yes.
That's the intuition.
Okay.
Okay, so we shall move to the next talk, but I wonder if there is a question from the audience, because I see an open microphone.